Jeppe Marchetti, an Italian soldier's dawn of doubt. On the sweltering morning of the 10th of June 1940, in the barracks of serene Ica, Libya, Italian infantryman Jeppe Marchetti, 23, found himself grappling with a profound, almost unpatriotic mixture of emotions. Conscripted 18 months earlier from his small Tuscan farming village, where he had been studying to be a teacher, he was now part of Mussolini's army, watching his officers prepare for the glorious campaign to expand the new Roman Empire into British-held Egypt. Intellectually, Marchetti understood he should feel pride and enthusiasm about Italy's entry into the war and the opportunity to seize territory from a British force distracted by the German onslaught in France. However, his actual feeling was one of deep anxiety. He saw his unit being asked to march into the Libyan desert with glaring deficiencies: inadequate equipment, some rifles were relics from the First World War, incomplete training, and leadership more preoccupied with grand gestures than the practical realities of desert warfare. The hot, cramped barracks offered no comfort. The existing water supply was insufficient even for the current garrison, let alone an invading army. Moreover, the vehicles meant to transport them hundreds of miles across the desert were prone to mechanical failures, which could not be reliably repaired due to a scarcity of spare parts, highlighting the Italian industrial base's inability to provide the material support demanded by modern conflict. Despite these gnawing doubts, Marchetti kept silent. To voice them would be to brand himself as a defeatist or a coward. A part of him still wished to believe the confident assurances of his officers that superior Latin courage and determination would ensure a swift victory against the supposedly weak and overextended British. Yet, another part of him suspected that courage was a poor substitute for competent planning and adequate equipment when facing an enemy already fighting for its survival for nearly a year. The Desert War's collision of ambition and reality. This is the narrative of the North African War's beginning. Italy's ill-prepared invasion of Egypt from Libya between September and December 1940. It chronicles the stunning British counteroffensive Operation Compass, which would shatter Italian forces and capture over 130,000 prisoners from December 1940 to February 1941. Fundamentally, this is the story of what happens when military ambition violently collides with material reality in the unforgiving environment of the Western Desert. Here, mistakes were punished with a severity unknown in temperate Europe. Over the next 70 minutes, we explore the complete experience of the Desert War's first phase, not merely as a sequence of tactical victories and defeats, but as a profoundly human drama. The fates of empires intersected with the individual experiences of soldiers thrust into an alien and hostile environment where merely surviving the climate and terrain was as challenging as facing enemy action. Commanders made calculations driven by political pressures, detached from military realities on the ground, and the desert's vast emptiness created psychological challenges no one had fully anticipated. The clash between Italian imperial ambitions and British imperial determination produced a campaign that would reshape the entire war's trajectory, in ways neither side fully grasped at the time. Comprehensive narrative, exploring the North African campaign from multiple perspectives. The Italian experience. Italian soldiers discovered the painful inadequacy of their equipment and training for the demands of the Desert War. The British transformation. British defenders evolved from a beleaguered garrison expecting defeat into an unexpected, successful offensive force. The commander's dilemmas. Leaders on both sides were forced to make decisions under extreme pressure, where political concerns frequently undermined military strategy. The civilian plight. The lives of Egyptians and Libyans were disrupted, caught between competing empires in a conflict where they held no stake. The desert as protagonist. The environment with its intense heat, vast emptiness, water scarcity, and the capacity to inflict death before combat even began was more than a backdrop. It actively shaped every facet of the campaign. Most historical accounts focus on the later stages, marked by the arrival of German forces under Erwin Rommel, which fundamentally changed desert warfare. However, they often minimize or skip the crucial opening period from June 1940 through February 1941. During this time, the war in North Africa was predominantly an Italian affair. Mussolini's legions invaded Egypt anticipating easy victories, but instead met with a series of catastrophes that exposed profound weaknesses in the Italian military. Meanwhile, British forces, led by commanders such as Archibald Wavell and Richard O'Connor, demonstrated that well-executed offensive operations could yield results far exceeding the predictions of a defensive mindset. Both sides learned harsh lessons from the desert regarding logistics, endurance, navigation, and the psychological toll of fighting in an environment where the body was in constant struggle against heat, dehydration, and the pervasive fine sand. This sand penetrated every piece of equipment and bodily orifice with a persistence designed to break down both machines and men. The reality of desert warfare extended far beyond mere tactical considerations of positioning and attack coordination, touching on fundamental challenges. Keeping soldiers alive and functional in temperatures often exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, maintaining vehicles against the mechanical inevitability of sand-destroyed engines and treads, and navigating across a featureless terrain where magnetic compasses often proved unreliable. How to supply forces across distances so vast that logistics consumed more resources than combat operations. And how to maintain morale among soldiers who found themselves fighting in a landscape so empty and featureless that it seemed to deny the very possibility of human meaning or purpose. By the end, you will understand not just what happened during these crucial months when Italy invaded Egypt and then suffered a defeat so comprehensive that it threatened to eliminate Italy's North African presence entirely, but what it felt like to be a soldier on either side experiencing the psychological dislocation of desert warfare, how commanders wrestled with decisions where political pressures to demonstrate aggressive action collided with military realities that counseled caution, why the Italian invasion failed so catastrophically despite numerical advantages that should have made Egyptian conquest achievable, how the British transformed from defensive stance to offensive action and achieved victories that surprised even their own commanders, what the desert environment demanded from human beings forced to fight within it, and why this first phase of the North African campaign established patterns and revealed truths about desert warfare that would shape every subsequent operation in this theater. This is the war in the desert, the complete human story of how it began, the strategic situation that led Italy to invade Egypt from Libya in September 1940, emerged not from careful military planning based on capabilities and objectives, but rather from Mussolini's psychological need to demonstrate that Italy was a great power worthy of equal standing with Germany. His desire to achieve military victories that would justify the fascist regime's rhetoric about restoring Roman imperial glory, and his fear that if Italy did not act quickly to seize British territory while Britain was reeling from the fall of France and the German threat of invasion, the opportunity would be lost forever, and Italy would emerge from the war as a minor partner rather than as a conqueror in its own right. Mussolini had declared war on Britain and France on June 10, 1940, timing his declaration to coincide with France's imminent collapse in what he hoped would be a costless intervention that would allow Italy to claim a share of the spoils without having to fight serious battles. A calculation that proved partially correct regarding France, where Italian forces achieved minimal gains at minimal cost. But that would prove catastrophically wrong regarding Britain, where Italian forces would discover that the British had no intention of negotiating away their Mediterranean interests, regardless of how desperate their strategic situation appeared. The decision to invade Egypt from Libya was driven by Mussolini's vision of Italian domination of the Mediterranean, his belief that seizing the Suez Canal would strike a mortal blow at British imperial communications and force Britain to negotiate, and his conviction that Italian soldiers possessed superior martial spirit that would overcome any material disadvantages they might face. A conviction that revealed Mussolini's fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare, where logistics, equipment quality, and competent leadership mattered far more than ideological enthusiasm or historical precedents about Roman military prowess. Marshal Rodolfo Grazzani, the Italian commander in Libya, who would be ordered to execute Mussolini's invasion plan, understood with painful clarity that the Italian forces under his command were inadequate for the task being demanded, that the logistical infrastructure required to support offensive operations deep into Egypt did not exist, that Italian equipment was inferior to British equipment in almost every category, that Italian training emphasized parade ground drill rather than tactical competence, and that morale among his troops ranged from uncertain to actively poor, because most Italian conscripts had no particular enthusiasm for fighting Britain in the desert thousands of miles from home. Graziani expressed these concerns to Mussolini in communications that documented the Italian military's weakness with a frankness that should have caused strategic reconsideration, noting that water supplies were insufficient, that transport vehicles were inadequate, both in number and quality, that anti-tank weapons were scarce and obsolete, that tanks were thinly armored and mechanically unreliable, that air support would be limited by the distance from Italian airfields to potential combat zones, and that the British defensive positions along the Egyptian border were stronger than Italian intelligence had initially assessed. Yet, Mussolini dismissed these objections as defeatism and cowardice, insisting that Graziani advance regardless of material conditions because political considerations demanded that Italy demonstrate military initiative before Germany achieved such complete victory over Britain that Italy's contribution would appear negligible. And because Mussolini had convinced himself that British forces in Egypt were weak and demoralized, and that even a poorly equipped Italian army would achieve victory through superior will and determination, a delusion that would be shattered by the reality of combat, but that in June and July 1940 seemed plausible to a dictator who had surrounded himself with subordinates too frightened to contradict his strategic fantasies. The Italian invasion of Egypt finally commenced on September 13th, 1943 months after Italy's entry into the war, with approximately 80,000 Italian troops and 250 tanks advancing across the border from Libya toward the British defensive positions near the coastal town of Sidi Barri, moving cautiously across terrain that offered few natural obstacles, but that presented immense logistical challenges because the distances involved stretched Italian supply lines beyond their capacity to maintain adequate stocks of water, food, ammunition, and fuel. The Italian advance covered approximately 60 meters in 3 days before stopping at Sidi Barani and establishing a series of fortified camps, a rate of progress so slow that it allowed British forces to withdraw in good order while demolishing infrastructure that might have aided Italian logistics, and a decision to halt and fortify, rather than continue pressing toward British positions deeper in Egypt, that reflected Graziani's recognition that his forces had already reached the limit of what their logistical ecosystem could support. The British force facing the Italian invasion consisted of approximately 36,000 troops organized as the Western Desert Force under the command of Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, significantly outnumbered by Italian forces, but better equipped, better trained, more mobile, and operating on interior lines that gave them logistical advantages that partially compensated for their numerical inferiority, creating a situation where the larger Italian army had advanced into Egypt, but lacked the capability to exploit their territorial gains, while the smaller British force retained the capacity for aggressive action if given the opportunity. For the Italian soldiers who established fortified camps at Sidi Barani and waited for resupply and reinforcement before advancing further into Egypt, the experience of those months from September through early December 1940 involved a peculiar combination of boredom, discomfort, and anxiety that eroded whatever enthusiasm they might have initially possessed for the campaign, because waiting in the desert proved psychologically corrosive in ways that active combat might not have been, creating conditions where the mind had too much time to contemplate the alienness of the environment and the apparent pointlessness of their presence in this empty landscape. Jeppe Marchetti, the young Italian infantryman who had entered the campaign with mixed feelings about Italy's imperial ambitions, found that months of sitting in a fortified camp, doing essentially nothing except enduring heat, sand, inadequate water rations, monotonous food, and the constant awareness that they were surrounded by hostile territory, created a psychological state that resembled depression more than anything else. A flattening of affect, where the capacity to care about outcomes or even about survival diminished week by week, as the desert's emptiness seemed to seep into the soul and hollow out whatever emotions had once animated life. The Italian camps at Sidi Bani were not prepared for sustained occupation, lacking adequate sanitation facilities, medical supplies, recreational opportunities, or even basic comforts that might have made the monotony bearable. And the combination of physical discomfort and psychological emptiness created morale problems that Italian officers seemed unable or unwilling to address through anything except increasingly hollow rhetoric about Roman imperial destiny, that struck most soldiers as absurdly disconnected from the reality of sitting in the sand waiting for orders that never came while their equipment deteriorated and their health declined. At the same time, British forces in Egypt were undergoing a transformation in both capability and mentality, as General Wavell and his subordinate commanders recognized that the Italian halt at Sidi Barri presented an opportunity to launch a counter-offensive that might achieve results far beyond what defensive operations could accomplish. Because while Italian forces had advanced into Egypt, they had done so in a way that left them overextended, poorly supplied, and vulnerable to determined attack. The planning for what would become Operation Compass began in November 1940, with Wavell authorizing Okanor to prepare a raid in force against Italian positions. Initially conceived as a limited operation designed to disrupt Italian preparations for their next offensive, rather than as a full-scale counterattack intended to drive Italian forces out of Egypt entirely. But as planning progressed, and as intelligence about Italian dispositions revealed greater vulnerabilities than anticipated, the scope of the operation expanded from raid to potentially decisive offensive if initial attacks succeeded in breaking Italian defensive cohesion. The British forces that would execute Operation Compass represented a combined arms force that included the 7th Armored Division, nicknamed the Desert Rats for their mobility and aggressive tactics. The 4th Indian Division, with its experienced troops and competent leadership, and supporting artillery, engineers, and logistics units that had been carefully positioned to enable sustained offensive operations across the distances that desert warfare demanded. But here's what most histories miss about this opening phase of the Desert War, and why it matters profoundly for understanding not just what happened, but why people made the choices they made, and how the psychological dimensions of desert warfare shaped operational outcomes in ways that went far beyond tactical considerations. The standard accounts emphasize the numerical disparity between Italian and British forces, the superior quality of British equipment and training, and the operational competence of British commanders compared to their Italian counterparts, presenting a narrative where Italian defeat was essentially inevitable once British forces launched their offensive. What these accounts often minimize or ignore entirely is the psychological and environmental context that made the desert such a distinctive theater of operations. Because the emptiness and hostility of the desert created challenges that went beyond military considerations to encompass fundamental questions about human adaptation to an environment that seemed designed to punish human presence. The soldiers on both sides had to learn how to function in temperatures that routinely exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and dropped to near freezing at night. How to maintain hygiene and health when water was scarce enough that washing became a luxury rather than a routine. How to navigate across terrain that offered no landmarks and where getting lost meant probable death from dehydration. How to maintain equipment when sand infiltrated every mechanism and destroyed moving parts with mechanical inevitability. How to preserve food and heat that spoiled supplies within days. How to treat wounds and illness when medical facilities were hundreds of miles away. And most fundamentally, how to maintain psychological stability when surrounded by emptiness so vast that it seemed to mock human concerns and reduce individual existence to meaningless insignificance. The nature of desert warfare, as it emerged during these first months of the North African campaign, differed from warfare in temperate climates, in ways that forced both sides to develop new doctrines and new psychological frameworks for conceptualizing combat, because the desert permitted mobility and maneuver on a scale that would be impossible in Europe, where roads, towns, rivers, and population density constrained movement. Yet the same desert imposed its own constraints through the tyranny of supply, where every gallon of water and fuel had to be transported across vast distances, and where running out of either meant death or capture, regardless of tactical skill or courage. British forces adapted to these conditions more successfully than Italian forces for reasons that went beyond equipment quality to encompass cultural and organizational factors, including the British military's long experience with colonial warfare in environments like India and Sudan, where heat and distance created similar challenges. The emphasis in British officer training on initiative and adaptation, rather than rigid adherence to doctrine, and the practical reality that British forces in Egypt were fighting for survival, while Italian forces were fighting for conquest, creating motivational asymmetries where the stakes for defeat were existentially different for the two sides. For British soldiers defending Egypt, losing meant potential expulsion from the Middle East and the severing of imperial communications through the Suez Canal, consequences so serious that they generated determination born from necessity. While 4 Italian soldiers invading Egypt, losing meant returning to Libya with national prestige damaged, but without existential consequences for Italy's survival, creating a psychological situation where Italian troops had less reason to accept the hardships and risks that desert combat demanded. Operation Compass launched on December 9th, 1940, with British forces attacking Italian positions at Sidi Bari in a carefully coordinated assault that exploited Italian weaknesses in defensive depth. Coordination between fortified camps and ability to respond to unexpected threats, achieving within the first day results that exceeded British planners. Optimistic projections because Italian resistance collapsed far more quickly and completely than anyone anticipated. The British attack employed tactics that would become characteristic of successful desert operations, including night movement to achieve surprise, concentration of force against specific objectives rather than broad front advances, aggressive exploitation of breakthroughs rather than pausing to consolidate, and reliance on mobility to bypass Italian strongpoints and attack from unexpected directions, creating conditions where Italian defenders found themselves cut off, surrounded, and forced to surrender before they could mount effective resistance or receive reinforcement. Within 2 days of Operation Compass's launch, British forces had captured Sidi Bari and were advancing west toward the Libyan border, taking thousands of Italian prisoners and seizing equipment and supplies that would prove valuable for sustaining the British offensive as it continued beyond its original limited objectives into what would become a pursuit across Cyrenaica that would eventually capture the Italian fortress of Bardia, the port of Tobruk, and by early February 1941, the entire eastern region of Italian Libya. For Italian soldiers experiencing the collapse of their defensive positions during Operation Compass, the psychological shock of defeat came not merely from the tactical surprise of the British attack, but from the sudden realization that the assurances they had received from their officers about Italian military superiority and British weakness were complete fabrications, that their equipment was inadequate to the task of fighting a competent enemy, that their training had not prepared them for the reality of mobile desert warfare, and that continuing to fight meant probable death or injury in service of objectives that no longer seemed achievable or even coherent. Jeppe Marchetti, the young Italian infantryman who had entered the campaign with these doubts that he had suppressed out of patriotic duty, found himself during the British assault at Sidi Bari, confronting the dissolution of whatever faith he had maintained in Italian military competence, watching as British tanks penetrated defensive positions that Italian officers had assured them were impregnable, as Italian artillery pieces that were supposed to provide protective fire remained silent because they lacked adequate put ammunition or because their crews had abandoned them, as the command structure that was supposed to coordinate defensive responses simply ceased to function. When communications broke down and officers fled or were killed, creating a situation where individual soldiers faced the choice between continuing futile resistance that would accomplish nothing except their own deaths, or surrendering to British forces who at least offered the prospect of survival, even if that survival came with the shame of captivity. The decision to surrender proved psychologically complex for Italian soldiers who had been raised on fascist rhetoric about martial valor and the dishonor of capitulation. Yet the practical reality was that continuing to fight when defeat was certain and when no reinforcement or relief was coming represented not courage but suicide. And most Italian soldiers chose surrender over death. Once it became clear that their situation was hopeless, creating prisoner of war totals that exceeded what British forces had anticipated. And that created significant logistical challenges, because the British had to house, feed, and transport tens of thousands of prisoners across the same desert terrain, where supplying their own forces was already difficult. The Italian prisoners captured during Operation Compass and the subsequent British advance across Cyrenaica numbered more than 130,000 by February 1941, a figure so large that it represented more prisoners than the entire British force that had launched the offensive, creating the almost absurd situation where a numerically inferior force had captured an army larger than itself, an outcome that revealed the extent to which Italian military performance had fallen below even the minimal standards necessary for effective combat operations. For the Italian prisoners, the experience of captivity involved its own psychological challenges, including the shame of defeat and surrender, the uncertainty about how long imprisonment would last and whether they would ever return home, the practical difficulties of surviving in prison camps that were barely adequate for housing and feeding such large numbers, and the recognition that they had been sent into combat by leaders who had been either incompetent or indifferent to their welfare, creating bitterness toward the fascist regime that had promised glory and delivered catastrophe. And what happens in the weeks between December 1940 and February 1941 will determine not just whether Britain can maintain its presence in North Africa, but whether Italy can survive as an independent military force in the Mediterranean theater. But the human drama unfolding here transcends the strategic implications, revealing something essential about courage, fear, endurance, and the surprising capacity of human beings to continue functioning under conditions that exceed what anyone should reasonably be expected to tolerate. For British soldiers advancing across Siraca in pursuit of retreating Italian forces, the experience combined elation at tactical success with exhaustion from the sustained physical demands of desert operations. Because while defeating Italian positions proved easier than anticipated, the distances involved and the environmental challenges of operating in the desert imposed costs that accumulated day by day until even victorious soldiers found themselves depleted in ways that went beyond simple physical tiredness, encompass a deeper weariness that affected judgment, morale, and the capacity for continued aggressive action. Lieutenant Colonel John Combe, commanding a mobile force that would become known as Combe Force, led his mechanized infantry across the desert in a race to cut off Italian retreat from Benghazi, covering 150 miles in 33 hours across terrain with no roads and limited navigation aids, pushing his vehicles and men to their absolute limits in pursuit of an objective that would capture thousands of additional Italian prisoners if achieved before Italian forces escaped. Yet paying a price in mechanical breakdowns and human exhaustion that would require weeks to recover from. Even after the immediate tactical objective was accomplished, the capture of Bardia in early January 1941, after a siege that demonstrated the limitations of Italian fortifications when attacked by determined combined arms forces, followed by the capture of Tobruk in late January, after another siege that again revealed Italian defensive weaknesses, and culminating in the capture of Benghazi in early February after British forces executed a desert flanking movement that cut off Italian retreat. Together, constituted a campaign that transformed the strategic situation in North Africa from one where Italy threatened Egypt to one where British forces threatened to expel Italy from Libya entirely and potentially from North Africa, altogether if the offensive could be sustained. Yet, even as British forces achieved these stunning victories, the same factors that had limited Italian offensive capability in September and October 1940, specifically the tyranny of logistics in desert warfare, where supply lines stretched across vast distances and where mechanical attrition reduced force strength regardless of combat losses, began to impose constraints on how far and how fast the British advance could continue, creating a situation where operational success outpaced logistical capacity and where commanders had to decide whether to consolidate positions already captured or to continue advancing and risk overextension that might create vulnerabilities if Italian forces received reinforcement from unexpected quarters. The physical environment of the Western Desert imposed demands on human beings that went beyond the obvious challenges of heat and thirst to encompass a comprehensive assault on every bodily system and every psychological defense mechanism that evolution had developed for survival in more forgiving environments. Because the desert was not merely hot and dry, but actively hostile in ways that created constant discomfort and constant awareness that human bodies were not designed for prolonged exposure to these conditions. The daytime heat during summer months could exceed 120 degrees F, temperatures at which physical exertion became dangerous because the body's cooling mechanism struggled to dissipate heat faster than the environment added it, creating conditions where soldiers had to limit activity during the hottest hours or risk heat exhaustion and heat stroke that could kill as surely as enemy action. The nighttime cold during winter months could drop below freezing, a temperature swing of 80 degrees or more that forced soldiers to carry both hot weather and cold weather clothing, despite weight restrictions that made every additional pound a burden. The lack of water meant that drinking had to be strictly rationed with daily allowances often limited to 1 or 2 liters per person, including water for cooking and washing, creating chronic mild dehydration that affected cognitive function, physical performance, and emotional stability in ways that accumulated over days and weeks until soldiers found themselves unable to think clearly or control emotional responses that would have been manageable under normal conditions. The sand and dust that characterized the desert environment penetrated everything with a persistence that seemed almost malicious, infiltrating vehicles to destroy engines and transmissions, infiltrating weapons to jam firing mechanisms, infiltrating food to make every meal gritty and unpleasant, infiltrating clothing to chafe skin into sores and rashes, infiltrating wounds to create infections that were difficult to treat, and infiltrating respiratory systems to create chronic coughs and breathing difficulties that sapped energy and made sleep difficult. The lack of landmarks meant that navigation required constant attention to compass bearings and odometer readings, creating situations where getting lost was an ever-present possibility, and where small navigational errors could result in forces wandering for days trying to find their objectives or their supply dumps, with death from dehydration being the eventual outcome if rescue did not arrive in time. The isolation that came from operating in the vast emptiness of the desert created psychological challenges that many soldiers found harder to manage than combat stress. Because while combat at least provided focus and purpose in the presence of comrades, the long periods between engagements when forces moved across empty desert or waited in defensive positions with nothing visible except sand and sky for miles in every direction created a sense of meaninglessness and disconnection from normal human existence that eroded morale and created depression that manifested in various ways. From apathy to irritability to reckless behavior that seemed designed to provide some kind of stimulation, even if that stimulation came from self-destructive actions. The turning point comes now, though not where conventional histories place it, or in the way you might expect from dramatic retellings that emphasize decisive moments and clear victories. Because the actual turning point is quieter, more ambiguous, and rooted not in any single tactical success, but in the gradual recognition among those involved that the Italian invasion of Egypt had failed completely, and that British forces had achieved victories that went far beyond what defensive operations were supposed to accomplish. Yet also that these victories had created a new set of challenges about how far to advance and when to consolidate that would determine whether British success in the first phase of the Desert War would lead to permanent expulsion of Italian forces or merely to temporary setbacks that could be reversed if circumstances changed. By early February 1941, British forces had captured Benghazi and were positioned to continue advancing west toward Tripoli, the capital of Italian Libya and the last major Italian stronghold in North Africa. Yet the same logistical constraints that had limited Italian offensive capability now limited British offensive capability, because supply lines from Egypt to the front had stretched across hundreds of miles of desert. Mechanical attrition had reduced British armored strength to a fraction of what it had been at the start of Operation Compass. And intelligence reports indicated that German forces might be preparing to intervene in North Africa to prevent complete Italian collapse, creating uncertainty about whether continuing the advance represented opportunity or overextension. The decision to halt the British advance in early February 1941 and to consolidate positions already captured rather than pushing to Tripoli would prove consequential for the entire subsequent course of the North African campaign, because it allowed Italian forces to establish new defensive lines, and more importantly, it provided time for German reinforcements to arrive in Libya and to transform the nature of desert warfare in ways that would make the next 2 years far more difficult for British forces than this first phase had been. Yet from the perspective of British commanders in February 1941, the decision to halt made sense given the information available at the time, because their forces were exhausted, their equipment was worn out, their supply lines were stretched to breaking point, and intelligence assessments suggested that continuing to advance with depleted forces toward an objective several hundred miles distant represented risk that exceeded potential gain. The counterfactual question of whether British forces could have captured Tripoli in February 1941 if they had continued advancing rather than halting remains contested among historians, with some arguing that one more push would have succeeded in expelling Italy from North Africa entirely, while others maintained that German intervention would have occurred regardless, and that overextending British forces would simply have created vulnerabilities without achieving lasting strategic advantage for the commanders on both sides, who made decisions during these crucial months. The psychological burden of responsibility for outcomes that would affect thousands of lives and potentially the entire war's trajectory created pressures that no training or experience could fully prepare them to manage. Because desert warfare involved uncertainties and complexities that went beyond the already rebated difficult challenges of military command in more conventional theaters. General Wavell, as British Commander-in-Chief Middle East, faced the impossible task of managing multiple simultaneous campaigns across a vast geographic area, including East Africa and Greece, in addition to North Africa, with limited resources that had to be allocated among competing priorities where strengthening one theater meant weakening another. And with political pressures from London demanding aggressive action even when military prudence counseled caution, creating conditions where every decision represented a compromise between what was militarily desirable and what was politically necessary. Marshal Grazzani, as Italian commander in Libya, faced his own impossible situation of trying to execute strategic objectives ordered by Mussolini while knowing that the resources available were inadequate for the tasks demanded, creating a moral dilemma about whether to continue obeying orders that he knew would lead to disaster or to refuse orders and face the consequences that defying a dictator would bring. A dilemma that he resolved by obeying while documenting his objections. A choice that saved his career in the short term, but that would ultimately lead to his removal after the disasters of Operation Compass made Italian leadership changes politically necessary. The question stands here at this critical moment in the narrative, and it's a question that transcends simple strategic analysis to touch on deeper issues of human psychology and moral philosophy, regarding the ethics of military command and the nature of responsibility when leaders send soldiers into situations where many will die regardless of decisions made. Could Italian forces have achieved better outcomes in the desert if they had been better equipped and better led? Or were the fundamental problems with Italian military culture and industrial capacity so deep that no amount of tactical competence could have overcome them? Did Mussolini's political need to demonstrate Italian military prowess create a situation where soldiers were sacrificed for objectives that were never achievable? And if so, what responsibility do political leaders bear for military disasters that result from their strategic fantasies? Could British commanders have achieved even more decisive results if they had taken greater risks and pushed harder despite logistical constraints? Or did their caution in halting the advance represent appropriate military judgment given the uncertainties involved? The debate among historians continues, and perhaps more importantly, the debate about how to evaluate human choices made under impossible circumstances continues, because these questions matter not just for understanding this specific moment, but for thinking about responsibility, judgment, and the nature of military leadership under conditions where all options lead to suffering. And the only question is which form of suffering represents the lesser evil. But the full impact of these months wouldn't become clear until much later. And even then, the strategic consequences that historians focus on represent only part of the story, because the deeper impact lay in what this experience did to the people who lived through it. Both the Italian soldiers who experienced comprehensive defeat that shattered whatever faith they had maintained in fascist military competence, and the British soldiers who achieved victories that created unrealistic expectations about how future desert campaigns would proceed. For Jeppe Marchetti, the Italian infantryman who had entered the campaign with doubts about Italian military capability, the experience of defeat and surrender, and months as a prisoner of war would fundamentally reshape his understanding of political authority and military service, creating a cynicism about fascist rhetoric that he would carry forward into post-war life, where he would become part of the generation that rebuilt Italy on different principles, rejecting the imperial fantasies that had led to disaster. For British soldiers who fought in Operation Compass, the experience of defeating Italian forces so comprehensively would create a dangerous complacency about the ease of desert warfare, a sense that victories would continue to come as easily in future operations as they had in this first campaign. An expectation that would be shattered when German forces arrived and demonstrated that desert warfare against competent opponents supported by adequate logistics would be far more difficult than the one-sided victories against poorly equipped Italian forces had suggested. The physical scars that soldiers on both sides carried from months of desert operations included not just combat wounds, but also the accumulated damage from environmental exposure, the skin conditions caused by constant sand and inadequate hygiene, the respiratory problems caused by breathing dust, the digestive issues caused by contaminated water and monotonous rations, the vision problems caused by intense sun and glare, and the general deterioration of health that came from months of pushing bodies beyond their designed operating parameters, creating medical conditions that would persist long after the immediate campaign concluded, and that would affect quality of life for years or decades. The psychological scars proved even more lasting for many who served in the desert, manifesting in various ways, from the persistent anxiety about water supply that made some veterans unable to feel comfortable unless they had water immediately available, even in peacetime settings, where dehydration was no threat, to the continued hypervigilance about navigation and orientation that made getting lost even in familiar civilian environments trigger disproportionate stress responses, to the difficulty readjusting to normal social interactions after months where human presence was scarce and where the vast emptiness of the desert had become the normal backdrop for existence. By the end of February 1941, the situation in North Africa stood transformed from what it had been when Italy invaded Egypt 5 months earlier, with British forces having achieved a victory so comprehensive that it seemed to eliminate Italy as a serious military threat in the theater. And that created optimism about potentially expelling Axis forces from North Africa entirely if sufficient resources could be allocated to continue the offensive. Yet, even as British commanders celebrated their successes and planned for future operations, the strategic landscape was shifting in ways that would soon make the victories of Operation Compass seem less decisive than they appeared in February 1941. Because Hitler had decided that Italy's collapse in North Africa could not be permitted to continue unchecked, and that German forces would need to intervene to stabilize the situation and to prevent the loss of Italy's African colonies from creating broader problems for Axis strategy in the Mediterranean and Middle East. The German intervention would transform desert warfare in ways that would make the next 2 years far more difficult for British forces, introducing new levels of tactical competence and operational sophistication that Italian forces had never demonstrated. Yet the fundamental challenges of desert warfare that both sides had learned during these first months, the tyranny of logistics, the environmental demands, the psychological toll would remain constant features of the North African campaign, regardless of which forces were engaged. This brings the story full circle from Jeppe Marchetti standing in a Libyan barracks in June 1940, preparing for what Italian propaganda promised would be a glorious campaign, to the same soldiers surrendering to British forces December, after months of discovering that the glorious campaign was actually a disaster waiting to happen. From Italian forces invading Egypt, expecting easy victories, to Italian forces retreating in disarray after comprehensive defeat. From British forces defending Egypt, expecting to fight a desperate holding action, to British forces advancing across Srina after achieving victories that exceeded their most optimistic predictions. But the question remains not just what this all meant strategically or historically, but what it meant to be human during these months. What it revealed about the nature of courage and fear in environments that pushed both to extreme limits, about the bonds that formed or failed to form between soldiers facing shared adversity, about the moral weight of decisions made by commanders who sent men into situations where death was probable, and about the psychological cost of both victory and defeat when survival itself required daily struggle against an environment that seemed designed to kill humans, regardless of their tactical skills or strategic objectives. These questions matter because they reveal something essential about the human experience of war that transcends the specific circumstances of this particular campaign, because they illuminate truths about what people become when tested in extreme environments and what societies reveal about their values when they send soldiers into the desert to fight for objectives that often seem disconnected from any concrete benefit to the individual soldiers doing the fighting. And because the answers that emerged from these months between June 1940 and February 1941 would shape not just the remainder of the North African campaign, but the broader understanding of what desert warfare demanded from those who fought it. The Italian defeat in Operation Compass represented more than just a military setback, revealing fundamental problems with fascist military culture that emphasized propaganda over substance with Italian industrial capacity that could not provide adequate equipment for modern warfare, with command structures that prioritized political loyalty over competence, and with strategic planning that was driven more by Mussolini's ego and ideological commitments than by realistic assessment of capabilities and objectives. Ives. The British victory in Operation Compass demonstrated that well-executed offensive operations could achieve results far exceeding what defensive mindsets predicted. That aggressive pursuit of defeated enemies could transform tactical victories into strategic breakthroughs that combined arms, coordination, and mobility were essential for success in desert warfare. Yet also that logistical constraints would ultimately limit how far and how fast any advance could proceed, regardless of tactical skill, creating tensions between operational opportunity and logistical reality that would characterize every subsequent phase of the North African campaign. The desert itself remained a constant throughout all these changes in fortune. The vast, empty landscape that cared nothing for human concerns, that killed inefficient armies and created hardships for efficient ones, that demanded respect from everyone who attempted to fight within it. And that would continue to shape military operations in North Africa for the next 2 years, until finally in May 1943, the Desert War would end with Axis forces expelled from North Africa entirely. But that conclusion lay far in the future, and the path from February 1941 to May 1943 would prove far more difficult and costly than anyone watching British victories in early 1941 could have predicted. Hitler would not allow his Italian ally to collapse completely in North Africa, understanding that doing so would threaten Axis control of the Mediterranean and would free British forces to be redeployed elsewhere in ways that would create strategic problems beyond just the loss of Libya. German reinforcements were already being prepared for deployment to North Africa. Forces that would arrive in February and early March 1941 under the command of a general who would transform desert warfare and become one of the war's most legendary figures. A general whose tactical skill and operational aggression would reverse many of the gains British forces had achieved during Operation Compass, and who would create a seesaw campaign across the desert that would continue for 2 more years, before finally being resolved in favor of Allied forces. The arrival of these German forces, the campaigns that would follow, the personalities that would clash, and the ultimate resolution of the North African theater belonged to the next chapters of the Desert War. But the foundation for everything that followed was laid during these first months, from June 1940 through February 1941, when Italy invaded Egypt and Britain counterattacked, when both sides learned harsh lessons about what desert warfare demanded, when thousands of soldiers experienced conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits, and when the strategic importance of North Africa became clear, even as the methods for achieving victory in this theater remained contested and uncertain. This is episode 23 of 100, covering every major moment of World War II in chronological order. Each episode running 65 to 75 minutes to provide not just the strategic overview and tactical details that shorter formats deliver, but also the psychological depth and emotional understanding that reveals what these events meant to the people who lived through them. From the Italian soldiers who discovered that fascist propaganda bore no relationship to military reality, to the British soldiers who achieved victories that created both pride and exhaustion. From the commanders making impossible decisions about where to advance and when to halt, to the civilians whose lives were disrupted by conflicts in which they had no stake. And from the desert environment itself that shaped every aspect of the campaign through its unforgiving nature that punished mistakes and imposed costs regardless of tactical skill or courage. This is comprehensive history for listeners who want to understand not merely what happened, but why people made the choices they made. How they managed to continue functioning under conditions that seemed designed to break human beings. What it cost them psychologically and emotionally to survive, whether in victory or defeat, and how the experience of desert warfare reshaped everyone who participated in it in ways that would persist long after the immediate campaign concluded. For the complete story, for the understanding of how the war unfolded from the German invasion of Poland to the Japanese surrender and beyond, subscription ensures access to every episode. This is history that treats its subjects as complete human beings, rather than chess pieces on a strategic map. History that acknowledges the moral complexity of impossible decisions. History that honors the experiences of those who lived through these events by attempting to understand them as fully and honestly as possible.